On the pitch, Xabi Alonso has never allowed himself to be weak, but that very thing has become the biggest burden he has had to carry for more than 2 decades. There is one life the world sees, calm, precise, almost flawless, and there is another life that exists in silence, where every pressure is held back, where every doubt is never spoken, where a man always has to control himself to the point where there is no room left for emotion. From when he was little, he was taught that mistakes were not an option, that perfection was not a goal, but a mandatory requirement. That followed him all the way to the peak of his career, where every wrong pass could change the outcome of a match, where every decision 1 second slow could make the whole team pay the price. But instead of showing the pressure, he chose silence, continuing to play as if everything was under control. That very suppression created a special willpower, an ability to endure that not everyone could understand. He did not collapse, not because he did not feel pain, but because he did not allow himself to do so. And over time, living between two worlds, one perfect in front of the public and one full of pressure inside, was no longer a choice, but became the only way he knew how to exist. But that very man who endured in silence built a career that very few players could reach. In the colors of Liverpool FC, he was the heart of the midfield and contributed to one of the most magical nights in history when he helped the team win the UEFA Champions League 2005, directly scoring the equalizer in the final in Istanbul, then going on to win the FA Cup 2006. When he moved to Real Madrid CF, he became a pillar in the journey to conquer La Liga 2011-12 with a record number of points, and especially the Champions League title 2014, the historic La Decima. In the bourgeois final years of his career at FC Bayern Munich, he continued to win many Bundesliga titles and maintained his level in one of the most competitive environments in Europe. On the international stage, he was an indispensable part of the Spain national team during its golden era with the Euro 2008 title, the World Cup 2010, and Euro 2012, contributing more than 100 appearances for the national team. He was not a loud or the most standout player, but his legacy lies in his consistency, tactical intelligence, and ability to control matches at the highest level, things that helped him become one of the greatest and most respected midfielders in modern football history. Before continuing this journey, please hit like and leave a heart as a way to acknowledge the man who chose silence to bear everything, without the world ever seeing it once. And if you want to understand what created that man who never collapses, please subscribe to the channel to step into the journey together, where everything began, from a childhood that never truly belonged to him. Born into a family where football was not a choice but almost a destiny, Xabi Alonso entered life with a standard already set before he was old enough to understand it. His father, Xabi Alonso, was a name that had stepped onto the biggest stadiums in Spain, a man who not only understood how to win but also understood the price of failure, and that is why he never allowed his son to grow up in ease. The house where Xabi grew up was not a place of unconditional praise, but a place of correction, of standards, of expectations that did not need to be spoken, but were always present. While many other children learned how to play, learned how to fall and laugh, learned how to fail without fear, Xabi learned how to stand straight, learned how to control the ball, learned how to read the game, as if his life had been directed from very early on into a path that did not allow mistakes. His afternoons did not end with the call to come home for dinner after playtime, but with long training sessions, where every small movement was observed, every pass was evaluated, every mistake was corrected immediately. There was no pause for emotion, no space for disappointment to be shown. If he passed wrong, he had to do it again. If he handled it slow, he had to do it faster. If he lost focus, he had to start over from the beginning. Those lessons were not only about football, but about how to exist in a world where perfection was not a choice but the minimum requirement. Gradually, He no longer reacted every time he was corrected, no longer showed annoyance or sadness. He just quietly adjusted, quietly did it again, quietly moved forward. A silence was formed not from natural growth, but from having no other choice. In such an environment, childhood did not disappear immediately, but it was narrowed down little by little until there was no longer enough space for it to exist. There were no harmless mistakes overlooked, no small failures seen as a normal part of growing up. Every mistake carried a bigger meaning, as if it could shape the person he would become later. And that made Xabi learn something more important than any football skill: self-control. Controlling the way he thought, controlling the way he reacted, controlling even what he felt. While other children cried when they lost, he learned silence. While other children got angry when criticized, he learned to listen. While other children sought comfort, he learned to stand up on his own without needing anyone's help. That habit did not form in one day, but was built through hundreds, thousands of small moments, moments that no one but him could remember, but left a deep mark on the way he saw the world. He began to think more before acting, to consider more before making decisions, and gradually he became a person who not only played football with his feet, but also with his mind. But along with that was a price he never truly realized when he was young. The ability to feel his own emotions became blurred, not because he had no emotions, but because he had gotten used to not letting them appear on the outside. In a family where football was the measure of value, where success was not something to celebrate but something expected, Xabi grew up with a wordless pressure that was always present. No one said he had to become a great player, but everything around him made him understand that was the only path. And when a person grows up in an environment where choices seem to have been decided in advance, they no longer learn how to choose. They learn how to adapt. He did not resist, did not question, did not try to go in another direction. He just kept walking, kept perfecting himself, kept becoming the version the world around him expected. And right in those seemingly ordinary years, something was shaped permanently. Not just a better player, but a person who had gotten used to keeping everything inside, who had gotten used to not showing weakness, who had gotten used to existing without needing to be understood. When he grew up, stepped into bigger stadiums, faced bigger pressures, what he learned in childhood did not disappear, but became the foundation for everything that came after. A solid foundation, but also an invisible cage where he always had to keep himself in a state of perfection, not allowed to make mistakes, not allowed to collapse, and also not allowed to let anyone see that sometimes, inside that calmness, there were still things he had never learned how to face. The name Perico Alonso never left Xabi Alonso's life, even when he began to take his first steps on his own path. In the world of football, where every story is told through names, titles, and deeply etched memories, being the son of a once successful player was not a privilege, but a shadow always present behind him, quiet but never disappearing. From when he was very young, before he had the chance to prove who he was already attached to a title he did not choose. People did not ask how he played, but whether he was like his father. People did not look at what he could do, but at what they expected him to do. And in an environment where every look came with comparison, becoming himself seemed like a luxury. The training sessions, the first matches, the small steps in his young career were all placed under a special lens, where everything was not only evaluated by general standards, but also by a higher standard, the standard of a name that had existed before. If he played well, that was expected. If he made a mistake, that was a bigger disappointment than usual. There was no gray area, no space to develop naturally. Everything was clear, decisive, and sometimes cruel. In moments like that, he was not only playing to win, but playing to prove that he deserved to stand there. Not because he was someone's son, but because he was someone's son, but because of his own ability. But proving himself was not a process with an end point. It stretched on, repeated, and became an inseparable part of life. Even as he progressed, even as he matured, even as he began to be recognized, that shadow was still there, only changing shape, but not disappearing. At every higher level, the comparison did not decrease, but only became more subtle. No longer direct questions, but looks, comments, implicit evaluations that he could feel but could not react to. And in that silence, something began to form. Doubt. Not doubt about his football ability, but doubt about his true worth. If it were not for that name, would he still be here? If it were not for his father's past, would his path have been different? Questions like that were never spoken, but existed like quiet thoughts that followed him through every stage of his career. And because he was not someone who showed emotion, not someone who sought confirmation from the outside, all of that was only kept inside, where it did not disappear but only settled, accumulated, and became part of who he was. In a world where fame could open doors but could also become an invisible shackle, Xabi learned to accept the reality that he might never completely escape that shadow. But instead of fighting it, he chose to live with it as part of himself. He did not try to deny his origin, nor did he try to completely separate from it. Instead, he focused on doing the best he could, day by day, match by match, as if every small step forward was a way to affirm his independent existence. However, the price of that choice was not small. When a person always feels they must meet the standard, must not make mistakes, must not disappoint anyone, they gradually lose the ability to accept the imperfect parts of themselves. Xabi no longer played football just for joy, but for responsibility, no longer simply a player, but a person carrying expectations, carrying a name, carrying a standard he was never allowed to fall below. And over time, that not only affected the way he played, but also shaped the way he saw himself, always having to be better, always having to be more precise, always having to control better. There are players who find motivation in pressure, but there are also players whose entire being is shaped by pressure. Xabi belonged to the second group. He did not resist pressure. He absorbed it, turned it into part of the system he operated every time he stepped onto the field. But when pressure became part of the person, it was no longer something that could be left behind after each match. It followed him in his thoughts, in his decisions, in the way he reacted to the world around him, and gradually, always having to meet the standard was no longer an external requirement, but became an inner voice. A standard he set for himself, stricter than anyone else's. And right in the journey of trying to escape someone else's shadow, he unintentionally created another shadow. The shadow of perfection that he himself had to live with. A shadow no one could see, but always present, always close, always reminding him that no matter how far he went, no matter how much he achieved, there was always a higher standard waiting. A standard he was never allowed to fail to reach. In an environment where every mistake was magnified and every sign of weakness could become a point to be exploited, Xabi Alonso gradually understood that emotions were not something that could be brought into the light. No one said it to him directly, but he saw it in the way other players were criticized, in the way small mistakes were turned into big stories, in the way losing composure for just one moment could overshadow an entire perfect match. And from very early on, he chose a different path, not because it was easier, but because it was the only path that allowed him to exist without being swept away. He began to learn how to keep everything inside, not to show confusion, not to express disappointment, not to react when doubted, not to reveal when hurt. On the field, he became a still point amid the chaotic movements, a person his teammates could trust, a person opponents found hard to read. But behind that calmness was a long process of suppression through every day, every match, every year. Maintaining calmness did not come naturally. It was trained, repeated, and became a reflex. When facing pressure, he did not react immediately, but stepped back one beat in his mind, considered, adjusted, then acted. When making a mistake, he did not let emotion take over, but quickly returned to position, continued moving as if it had never happened. Those around him saw a player who never panicked, a person who always maintained stability, but no one really knew what happened inside that short moment. Where emotion appeared then was extinguished before it could spread. Over time, he not only controlled his actions, but also controlled the way he felt, as if emotion was also part of the match that needed to be regulated. Pressures not shared did not disappear, they only changed form. There were no long conversations about fear, no complaints about fatigue, no moments of fully revealing oneself. He kept everything to himself, not because he had no need to speak, but because he was not used to doing so. In a world where strength was often defined by the ability to endure, he became the model of that endurance. A person who could continue without explanation, a person who could stand firm without needing support. But that also created a distance, not only between him and others, but between him and himself. When a person gets used to not sharing, they also gradually forget how to recognize what they are really feeling. The image he built was not a media strategy, but the result of years of self-adjustment. A player who did not react, did not draw attention, did not let emotion control him. A person who always appeared with the same expression, the same rhythm, the same precision. That brought trust, brought stability, but also meant he had to maintain it in every situation, with no exceptions. Whether it was a big match or a difficult moment, he still had to keep that state, as if nothing was big enough to change him. And when an image is repeated long enough, it is no longer a role but becomes part of the person. The silence gradually became a shell, not to hide anything specific, but to protect an inner space he did not want or did not know how to share. He did not seek attention, did not seek understanding, did not try to explain himself. He just continued, step by step, the way he had always done. But that silence was not empty. It contained everything that was not said, all the thoughts never shared, all the pressures never released. And over time, it became an inseparable part, a way of existing that he no longer questioned. There are people who show emotion to release pressure, but there are also people who keep everything and learn to live with it. Xabi belonged to the second group. He did not try to escape pressure. He adjusted himself to fit it. He did not resist what happened inside. He controlled it, kept it at a level where he could continue without being affected. But when control became a habit, it also created a limit, a boundary he rarely crossed, a boundary between what was shown and what was kept, between the person the world saw and the person he kept for himself. And right in that long silence, something gradually became clearer, even if no one said it. When a person spends too much time controlling everything, they also pay the price of never being allowed to let go. There is no moment of collapse to start over, no space to be weak without being judged, no opportunity to simply be an ordinary person. There is only continuation, maintenance, and a standard that never lowers. And when all of that becomes normal, he no longer wonders if he could live differently, but only continues to live in the only way he knows. In a football world that increasingly honors speed, technique, and explosive moments, Xabi Alonso always seemed to stand in a different position, not at the center of the spotlight, but at the edge of attention, where his contributions were hard to see immediately. He was not the one with dribbling moves that made fans stand up, not the player who scored decisive goals to appear on the front page, nor the typical model of a star that the media could easily build. And that very thing made him, for a long time, seen as a player lacking something special, lacking what people called the aura of a big star. Comments like that were not always said directly, but they existed in the way he was mentioned, in the way he was compared to others, in the way each of his performances always seemed to need an extra explanation. There was no moment when he completely escaped those questions. Even when he played well, when he controlled the match perfectly, there was still a feeling that what he did was what he should do, not something worthy of praise. And when he did not reach that level of perfection, the doubt returned quickly, as if it had never left. The evaluating looks, the comparative comments, the invisible standards he always faced, all created a pressure that was not loud but prolonged, a pressure that made him never truly feel he had done enough. In an environment where standout quality was often measured by explosive moments, becoming a stable person, someone who did everything the right way but did not immediately impress, sometimes became a disadvantage. The fear of not being good enough did not appear like a storm, but like a quiet flow seeping through every stage of his career. It did not stop him, did not make him quit, but was always present, like a reminder that he had to do more, had to be better, had to be more precise. And because he was not someone who showed emotion on the outside, no one really saw the level of that pressure. On the field, he was still the calm one, the one in control, the one making the right decisions. But inside, every pass, every touch came with a question. Is this enough yet? Not enough to exist, but enough to be recognized, enough to not be doubted, enough to hold the position he had worked so hard to achieve. That is why consistency was not just a quality, but became an obligation. He could not rely on brilliant moments to compensate for mistakes, because he was not that type of player. He had to maintain a high standard in every match, every situation, every decision. There was no day off for concentration, no space for distraction. Every time he stepped onto the field was another time he had to prove himself from the beginning, as if what he had done before was not enough to guarantee what was to come. And in such a repeating cycle, fatigue came not only from the physical, but from having to constantly maintain a level of precision that very few people could understand. Self-doubt did not disappear even when he began to achieve clearer successes. It only changed how it showed itself, becoming more subtle, harder to notice, but no less influential. Even when recognized, even when becoming an important part of the team, he still did not fully believe he had escaped the initial evaluations. Because when a feeling is formed too early and lasts too long, it does not easily disappear just because circumstances change. It becomes part of the way he sees himself, an internal standard he always has to measure against, an inner voice that is never completely silent. In the eyes of others, he was the model of stability, of control, of a player who always did what needed to be done. But in his own mind, he was still the one who had to prove himself, still the one who had not fully reached the level he thought he needed to reach. And perhaps that very thing kept him at a level of focus that few could maintain, but at the same time made him never truly feel relieved. There was no moment when he could completely let go of the pressure, completely believe he had done enough, completely accept that what he had done was worthy. And when a person lives too long with the feeling of having to prove himself, they gradually forget how to accept. They no longer seek recognition from the outside, but they also do not give themselves recognition from within. They continue to move forward, continue to do better, continue to maintain, but never stop to realize how far they have come. For Xabi, the fear of not being good enough was not something that pulled him down, but something that pushed him forward. But for that very reason, it never left. It stayed, quietly, patiently, and became a part of the journey he could not separate from, a part of the person he had become. When Xabi Alonso left Spain to join Liverpool FC, he did not just change colors, but stepped into a completely different world, where everything happened faster, stronger, and harsher than anything he had ever experienced before. The Premier League did not allow time to think, did not allow slow rhythms to control, and certainly did not allow small mistakes to be overlooked. On the field, every decision had to be made in a split second, under the pressure of relentless pressing, continuous collisions, and the roar of the stands that never stopped. For a player who was used to controlling the pace, to reading the game and adjusting every pass, that was a challenge not only physically, but also in the way he existed in an environment that did not wait for anyone to adapt. The first days were not easy. The speed of the matches forced him to change the way he thought, to shorten decision-making time, to handle the ball faster while still maintaining the precision that had become instinct. His body had to adapt to collisions he rarely faced before, to duels that were not just technique but also strength. But the biggest difficulty did not lie in the things that could be seen. It lay in having to hold himself steady while everything around forced him to change. He could not become a different player just to fit in, but he also could not keep everything exactly as before without being swept away. The pressure came not only from the pitch but also from the stands and the media. Liverpool was a club that did not just play, but lived with the emotions of millions of fans, where every match carried expectations and every mistake was magnified. The cheers could lift a player up, but they could also become heavy pressure on every step. In such an environment, players who easily showed emotion could find release. But for Xabi, who was used to keeping everything inside, that pressure simply got added, not shared, not released, only absorbed and carried on. On the field, his role became increasingly important, even if it was not always clearly recognized. He was not the one scoring goals, not the one creating moments that made the whole stadium explode, but he was the one who kept everything running, the one who connected the lines, the one who adjusted the pace, so the team did not get swept into chaos. Those contributions did not always appear on the scoreboard, did not always get mentioned in big headlines, but they existed in every ball, every decision, every moment when the match needed someone to maintain balance. And perhaps that was why he continued to be an indispensable part without needing to stand in the center of attention. His silence did not change, even when doubts still existed. There were matches where he was criticized for not being fast enough, not strong enough, not standout enough. There were times when his role was questioned, when the team looked for other solutions, other choices that seemed more suitable for the pace of the league. But his reaction never changed. There were no explanations, no objections, no gestures showing dissatisfaction. He just continued, repeating what he had done, holding firm to his way of playing as if those evaluations did not exist. That did not mean he was not affected. Every criticism, every doubt was noted, but not to react, but to adjust. He did not try to prove with words, but with consistency, with appearing in every match with the same level of focus, the same precision. In an environment where explosions were often noticed more than stability, he chose the harder path, becoming the one who was always there, always doing it right, always keeping everything under control, even if that might not bring immediate recognition. Over time, his adaptation was not only about catching up with the speed of the matches, but also about understanding how to exist in an ever-changing environment. He learned to move faster without losing precision, learned to contest more strongly while still keeping calm, learned to make decisions in shorter time without losing his essence. But most importantly, he learned to continue being himself in a world that always tried to change him. The silence he carried from the years before did not disappear but became clearer in the noisy environment. When there were cheers around, pressure, continuous evaluation, his silence became an anchor, not only for himself, but for the whole team. He did not need to say much to be heard, did not need to show to be recognized. He just needed to appear, hold his position, perform his role correctly, and let what he did speak for itself. But behind that stability, behind the image of a player who always controlled everything, there was still a man carrying all the pressure that had accumulated from before. The only difference was that at Liverpool, those pressures became bigger, clearer, and heavier. And when everything around became noisier, the silence inside him also became deeper, as if that was the only way for him not to be swept away, not to be broken, not to show any sign that behind it all, he was still continuing to fight in his own way. The Istanbul night in 2005 was one of the rare moments when the football world seemed to stop to witness the impossible, and Xabi Alonso stood right at the center of that storm, not as a loud character, but as a quiet anchor keeping everything from completely collapsing. When Liverpool FC went into the second half trailing 3 goals to AC Milan, everything seemed to be over. Not only in terms of the score, but also in spirit. Other teams might have collapsed, might have accepted defeat as inevitable, but Liverpool did not do that. And in that unbelievable comeback, Alonso was an indispensable part, not because he scored the first or the last goal, but because he kept the rhythm of hope from being broken. When the opportunity came to him from the penalty spot, that was not just a shot, but a moment when everything could change or end completely. The first kick was saved, but he did not stop, did not wait, did not hesitate. He rushed in, struck the second time, and the ball went into the net, bringing the equalizer, bringing the match back to the starting line, bringing the whole world into a state of disbelief. In that moment, the stadium seemed to explode. The screams, the huds, the tears, all blended together to create one of the most emotional scenes in football history. Teammates ran toward him. Fans called his name. Everything around burst open, but he himself still kept one thing that had followed him through the years before: control. There was no crazy celebration, no outburst of emotion beyond limits, only a measured reaction, a focused look, as if he understood that the match was not over yet, that the job was not done. In a world where moments like that usually brought strong release, his reaction went against it. Not because he did not feel the importance of the goal, but because he was used to not letting emotion control action. That goal became part of history, not only of Liverpool but of the Champions League, a symbol of resilience, of the ability to turn the situation around when everything seemed lost. And Alonso's name was written into it, not as the most standout star, but as an indispensable link in the chain of events leading to the miracle. But what was notable was not his presence in that moment, but the way he left it. After the match, when the cup was lifted, when all the lights were on, the heroes of the Istanbul night, he remained himself, unchanged, not different, not swept up in the glory that covered everything. There are players who are shaped by one moment, lifted by one goal, remembered as symbols of a victory. But for Alonso, that moment did not change who he was. It did not erase the doubts, did not make the pressures disappear, did not make him see himself in a different way. He did not become someone else just because he scored an important goal. He remained the one who had to keep the rhythm, the one who had to control, the one who had to maintain stability in every next match. And perhaps that was exactly what made that goal carry a different meaning, not as the end point of a journey, but only as one part in the long chain of moments where he had to continue proving his value. In the days after, when the world continued to talk about Istanbul, when the images were replayed, when the stories were told with excitement and pride, his life did not change in the way many people imagined. He did not immerse himself in the spotlight, did not use the moment to build an image, did not turn it into an anchor to reduce pressure. He returned to the training ground, returned to the training sessions, to the familiar demands, to the standards he had always set for himself. And in all of that, the goal in Istanbul was just a detail, important, but not enough to define the whole person he was. The difference lay in the fact that while others might look at that moment as a peak, a place to stop and look back, Alonso saw it as part of the job, something that needed to be done, a responsibility fulfilled at the right time that did not reduce the value of the goal, but changed the way it existed in his life. It was not an emotional anchor, but a proof of the way he had always approached football, focused, precise, and not letting anything, no matter how big, change his essence. And perhaps, right in the moment when the whole world burst open, the silence inside him became clearer than ever, not because he did not feel joy, but because he did not allow himself to stop long enough to truly live in it. When the final whistle blew, when history was rewritten, when his name was mentioned along with other heroes, he had already started thinking about what came next, about the next match, about the next task, because for him, There was no moment big enough to change the path he had chosen, a path where every success had to be set aside to make way for continuation, for maintenance, for a standard that was never allowed to drop. After the Istanbul night, where everything seemed to have changed, reality returned to a familiar rhythm, where Xabi Alonso still had to face questions that had never really disappeared. Success did not erase doubt, and one historic moment was not enough to guarantee absolute trust in an ever-changing environment. The following seasons brought different challenges, no longer about proving that he could contribute, but about maintaining a position in a team looking for renewal, where every tactical decision could change the role of each individual. In that context, Alonso was no longer an irreplaceable part, but became a choice that needed to be considered. An important link, but not the only one. There were times when his form was questioned, not because he played clearly badly, but because he did not stand out in the way people expected. In a team that needed explosive moments, decisive goals, touches that immediately changed the situation, his role, keeping the rhythm, regulating, ensuring balance, became harder to see, and therefore easier to be undervalued. Comments began to appear, not always direct, but enough to create a feeling that he was no longer in as safe a position as before. Discussions about changing the midfield, about looking for other players more suitable for the pace of the matches, began to be mentioned. And even if they did not always lead to specific actions, they still existed as pressure that could not be ignored. The team considered new options, different approaches, and in those moments, Alonso was no longer seen as the only anchor. There were matches where he was not used, times when he had to sit out and watch, a position he was not used to but had to accept. For many players, that was the time to react, to show dissatisfaction, to seek explanations. But for Alonso, that reaction never appeared. He did not speak up, did not express discontent, did not create any sign that he was affected. He continued training, continued preparing, as if everything was still going according to plan. His silence was not easy acceptance, but the result of a long process that had formed before. He was not used to arguing to defend his position, not used to demanding recognition. Instead, he returned to what he could control, performance on the field. When given the opportunity, he played with the same level of focus, the same precision, the same approach that had shaped who he was. There was no big change, no forced effort to stand out more, only the continuation of a standard he had always maintained. But that very stability sometimes became a double-edged sword. It helped him hold his position in difficult periods, but it also made him not get noticed in moments when standout quality was prioritized. When the team looked for difference, stability was not always the most highly valued, and in such periods Alonso continued to exist in a quiet state, where he did everything right but was not always recognized proportionally. The seasons passed, the pressure did not decrease but only changed form. No longer direct questions about ability, but doubts about his role, about suitability, about whether he was still the best choice for the future. And in all of that, he did not change the way he faced it. There was no resistance, no revelation, only continuation. He accepted that in a big collective, position was not always guaranteed, that trust was not permanent, and that every opportunity had to be seized as if it were the last one. Enduring in silence was not easy, especially when efforts were not always seen. But for Alonso, that was not a new choice, but the way he had always lived. These years did not bring shining moments like Istanbul, did not have iconic goals, but they were periods that shaped him more deeply. There, he not only faced opponents on the field, but also the doubts around him, the changes inside the team, the feeling that he always had to prove himself from the beginning again. And perhaps, right in those uncertain years, his true nature became clearer than ever, not in big victories, but in difficult moments, when recognition was no longer there, when trust was not complete, when everything became more fragile. He did not change to fit the circumstances, did not lose himself to seek position, but continued in the only way he knew, holding firm, controlling, and not letting anything break the structure he had built. But the price of that persistence was not none. When a person continuously had to prove, continuously had to maintain, continuously had to endure without a chance to release, the pressure did not disappear. It only accumulated, and over time, it became an inseparable part, an invisible burden he carried, not only on the pitch, but in the way he saw himself, a burden that did not stop him but also never allowed him to truly feel light. Leaving Liverpool FC to join Real Madrid CF was not a simple step forward in Xabi Alonso's career, but stepping into an environment where every standard was pushed to the highest level, where there was no concept of good enough, only even better or be replaced. If at Liverpool he had to adapt to speed and physicality, then at Madrid he faced a different pressure, deeper, heavier, and more constant. The pressure of having to be perfect in a collective full of big names, where every player carried a strong ego and enormous expectations from outside. The Santiago Bernabéu Stadium was not just a place to play, but a place of judgment. Every pass, every touch, every decision was followed and evaluated in real time, not only by tens of thousands on the stands, but also by millions outside. There, mistakes were not forgotten, but repeated, analyzed, and sometimes magnified far beyond reality. For a player used to control, having to maintain precision in such an environment was not only a professional requirement, but a prolonged psychological pressure, where there was no room for off-form days. In that lineup, around him were players capable of making an immediate difference, people who could change the match with just one moment. Names like Cristiano Ronaldo, players who could score, who could create images that made the whole world pay attention, made Alonso's role even less visible, even if no less important. He was not the one who finished, not the one mentioned first when the team won, but he was the one who kept everything running, the one who ensured that those explosive moments had a foundation to exist. Keeping that role in an environment like Madrid required not only skill but also an almost absolute stability. There was no space for fluctuation, no chance to gradually regain form. Every match was a new test. Every time on the field was a time to prove he deserved his position. And in a team where internal competition always existed, maintaining form was not only to win but also to survive. The period under Jose Mourinho brought a different kind of pressure. No less tense, it was a time when every match was not only a confrontation on the field, but also a clash of tactics, personalities, and expectations. The atmosphere in the dressing room became more tense. The tactical demands became stricter, and every player had to adapt to an uncompromising approach. In that system, Alonso played a central role in ball distribution, in maintaining structure, in keeping the team from breaking under opponent pressure. But that also meant he had to bear a large part of the responsibility when things did not go according to plan. Big matches, tense confrontations, moments where every decision could change the situation, all placed a burden on his shoulders that was not always seen. When the team played well, attention went to the goal scorers, the ones who created decisive moments. When the team struggled, the eyes turned to the midfield, to the regulator, to the one responsible for controlling the match. And in both cases, he still kept one thing: silence. There were no explanations to the media, no reactions to pressure from the stands, no expressions showing he was affected. He continued to appear with the same face, the same way of moving, the same rhythm. For many, that was a sign of strength, of a player not shaken by circumstances. But behind it was a non-stop process of maintenance, an effort not to allow any factor to break the structure he had built for himself. There are players who find freedom in big clubs. But for Alonso, Madrid did not bring release but a higher level of the pressure he was familiar with. He did not change to fit the lights, did not try to become the center, did not force himself to do things outside his nature to get attention. He just continued doing what he had always done, at a higher level, under greater pressure, in a harsher environment. And perhaps that was exactly what made him an indispensable part without ever really being placed in the center. He was the one who kept the system running, the one who connected individuals into a collective, the one who ensured that big moments could happen. But he was not the one remembered first. Not the name that appeared most in stories about victories. He existed in a different position, where value was not measured by attention, but by necessity. In those years when pressure never decreased, when expectations never lowered, he continued to live the way he had always lived, keeping everything under control, not showing fatigue, not allowing himself to slow down. And when a person had to maintain that state for a long time, it was no longer an effort, but became part of his nature, a way of existing that he no longer questioned. But also, in that process, the price of perfection gradually became clearer, not to the outside world, but to himself. In moments no one saw, when Xabi Alonso set foot at FC Bayern Munich, it was no longer a step to prove himself like the years before, but a journey to the final segment of his career, where what he carried was not only experience, but also the full weight of the years that had passed. At Bayern, he was no longer a young player who had to adapt, nor a controversial signing, but a recognized person, a football brain stepping into a system built with almost absolute precision under Pep Guardiola's leadership. But even in that seemingly perfectly fitting environment, a different form of pressure began to become clear, no longer coming from outside doubt, but from what he himself understood about the game. Working with Guardiola was not just executing tactics, but approaching football at a deeper level, where every position, every movement, every decision had meaning in an overall structure. For Alonso, that was not unfamiliar, but the level of detail and demand of this system pushed everything to a new limit. He not only had to play correctly, but had to understand why he played that way. Had to read the game not only by what was happening, but by what could happen. And when a player began to see everything more clearly, the pressure also became heavier, because there was no longer room for the unconscious, no longer moments allowed to simply react by instinct. His body, after many years at the highest level, began to send signals he could not completely ignore. The runs were no longer as light as before, the duels required more effort, consecutive matches began to leave traces. But what was notable was that those traces were never shown on the outside. There was no complaining, no clear signs of fatigue, no moments where he revealed that he was slowing down. He continued to move, continued to pass the ball, continued to keep the rhythm, as if his body still operated at the perfect level as before. The pressure at this point no longer came from having to prove he was good enough, but from having to maintain a standard he had set for himself throughout his career. When a player had gotten used to not making mistakes, accepting that he might no longer be at his peak became harder than any previous challenge. And for Alonso, that was not expressed in words, but in persistence, in every training session, every match, every moment where he still tried to keep everything under control. In Guardiola's system, his role became clearer than ever. Not because it was new, but because it was placed in a structure where every detail was optimized. He was the connector, the regulator, the one who ensured everything happened according to the intention. But at the same time, he was also the one who had to take responsibility if that structure was broken. When opponents found ways to apply pressure, when the pace of the match changed, when passes no longer reached absolute precision, everything came back to his position, like a center around which everything revolved. The accumulated fatigue was not only physical but also mental. When a person had spent too many years maintaining the highest level of focus, continuing to do so became increasingly difficult, not because they no longer had the ability, but because they had spent too much energy to maintain that state. But for Alonso, reducing pressure was not an option. He did not know how to play at a lower level, did not know how to accept mistakes, as a natural part of the process, because his entire career was built on limiting mistakes to the minimum. Those around him could see an experienced player, a person who still kept calm, a person not affected by age in the way many others were. But they did not see what happened inside, where each match demanded a little more, where each decision needed an extra effort to achieve the precision as before. And in that small gap, fatigue began to be present, not as a collapse but as a thin layer accumulated over time. Nevertheless, the image he showed on the outside did not change. He was still the calm one, still the one in control, still the one who did not reveal any sign that he was affected. His professionalism lay not only in the way he played football, but in the way he maintained himself in a state that few could keep for so long. Even as his career gradually approached the end, he did not lower the standard, did not change his approach, did not look for easier paths. And perhaps right in those years at Bayern when everything had reached clarity in tactics, in role, in his position in the football world, the price of perfection became clearer than ever, not as a moment of collapse, not as a big failure, but as a slow wearing down, where each passing day left a small trace, not big enough to change the image, but enough to accumulate into something only he could feel. And in all of that, he still continued as if nothing had changed, as if everything was still under control. Because that was not only the way he played football, but the way he lived. A way of living he had chosen long before stepping into the biggest stadiums, and a way of living he continued to maintain, even when his body and mind had begun to tell him that perhaps it was time to stop. Amid all the noisy stadiums, tense matches, and standards that never lowered, there was one place where Xabi Alonso did not need to become the perfect version of himself. And that was family. There were no lights, no evaluations, no scrutinizing looks at every gesture, every decision. There, he was not a midfielder who had to control the pace of the match. Not a name tied to expectations and responsibility, but simply a husband, a father, an ordinary person allowed to exist without needing to prove anything. Life beside his wife Nagor Erenburu and his children took place in almost absolute privacy. Like a world completely separate from the noise of top-level football, where he did not need to maintain an image, did not need to control every expression, did not need to weigh every reaction, as when standing on the pitch. Unlike many other players, he did not seek attention off the field. There were no private stories exposed, no images appearing densely in the media, no moments staged to maintain an image. He chose a different way of living, a way in which privacy was protected as something important, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because that was the only way to keep a part of the person that football could not touch. In a world where everything could become news, keeping personal life undisturbed became no small effort, and he did that consistently, like the way he did with everything else in his career. Time with family was not short breaks between matches, but real moments where he could temporarily step away from thoughts about tactics, about pressure, about what needed to be done next. Ordinary mornings, uninterrupted meals, times taking the kids to school, small moments that no one outside knew about but carried greater meaning than any match. There he did not need to control everything, did not need to always be right, did not need to maintain an impossible standard. He could slow down, could listen, could simply be present without needing to prove his value. The most important thing was not that he had a family, but the way he existed in it. He did not bring pressure from the pitch home, did not let failures or doubts affect those around him. When stepping through the door, he left behind everything that belonged to football, as if they were two completely different worlds. And perhaps that very separation helped him maintain a balance that not everyone could achieve. A balance that did not come from reducing pressure, but from knowing where pressure no longer existed. Family became the only place where he did not need to control his image. There were no standards to meet, no roles to maintain, no expectations to fulfill. There he could be himself, Not the version built over many years, but the real person behind all the shells. But that did not mean he completely escaped the habits that had formed. The calmness, the control, the way he thought before acting, all were still there. Not because he tried to keep them, but because they had become part of him. The balance between personal life and career was not a natural state, but the result of a continuous adjustment process. He did not give up football to seek peace, nor did he let football take over everything. Instead, he kept both, each in its own place, not letting them overshadow each other. That required a discipline no less than what he showed on the field, a clear awareness of what was truly important, and a determination to protect those things from the intrusion of outside pressure. But even in that balance, one thing did not change. The person he had become over many years still existed. He could leave the pitch, could leave the lights, but could not completely separate from the way he had learned to live. The control, the silence, the way he kept everything inside, all were still there, even when no longer necessary. And perhaps that was part of the price he had to pay. A price that could not be seen from the outside, but was always present in the way he existed. Family gave him a different space, a different rhythm of life, a feeling he could not find anywhere else. But it did not erase what had formed before, did not completely change who he was, but only gave a place where he could temporarily let go of a part of himself. And in a life where most of the time was spent controlling, maintaining, never collapsing, having such a place was not something obvious, but something rare, a small quiet space, but enough for him to continue walking, to continue holding firm, to continue being the person the world saw, while still keeping a part of the person that only those closest could understand. There are periods in a career when everything no longer takes place on the grass, where passes and tactical decisions are no longer the deciding factors, but instead there are questions about reputation, about the person, about everything a player has built over many years. With Xabi Alonso, the tax case in Spain was one of those moments, a challenge not related to football, but one that had the potential to affect the entire legacy he had worked so hard to build. The accusations did not appear as a minor incident, but like a big question mark placed over his name, a name that had always been associated with professionalism, discipline, and being free of scandal. In a world where an image can be changed in a very short time, being placed at the center of a legal case is not only a personal issue, but also a challenge in how he faces doubt from the outside. The media started reporting. Public opinion started analyzing, and his name was no longer only linked to matches or titles, but also to questions that no one could answer right away. For many people, that was the time to look for a quick solution, to end the story as soon as possible, to minimize the impact. But the way Alonso reacted went in a different direction, a direction he had always chosen throughout his life. He did not compromise, did not accept easy solutions just to close the issue. He did not plead guilty to avoid risk, did not try to withdraw from the legal process. Instead, he decided to pursue the case to the end, not to protect his career, but to protect the very person he had built. In a situation where the pressure did not come from the grass but from the legal system, from the media, from public opinion, that decision was not a simple choice. It prolonged the time, prolonged the attention, prolonged the doubts he had to face every day. The legal process did not happen quickly. It stretched through many stages, with court sessions, arguments, evidence presented and debated. Throughout that period, he continued to live the way he had always lived, in silence, focused, without showing any sign that he was being affected. There were no controversial statements, no strong reactions to the media, only the determination to pursue the path he believed was right. But that silence did not mean he did not feel the weight of what was happening. Pressure from public opinion is not like pressure on the grass. It has no time limit, does not end after 90 minutes, and has no final whistle to mark the end. It exists continuously, in every article, every comment, every remark from people who do not know him but still have opinions about him. And in a world where information spreads quickly, maintaining an image becomes more difficult than ever. But Alonso did not try to control how others saw him. He only controlled the way he reacted, as he had always done. There were times when the easier choice was to accept a deal, end the story, and move on. But for him, that meant accepting something he believed was not right. And in a life where he had always set high standards for himself, accepting that was not an option. He continued, step by step, through each stage of the legal process without changing his stance, without wavering under pressure. That was not stubbornness, but a form of determination that had become his nature. When the final verdict was delivered, when he was declared not guilty, the story did not end with an explosion of emotion. There were no strong reactions, no long statements, no release in the way many people might expect. He still kept the same way he had faced it from the beginning. Calm, in control, and moving forward. But behind that calmness was a long process that not everyone saw. A journey where he had to face doubts, not only from the outside, but sometimes even from those around him. Being exonerated was not only a legal victory, but also an affirmation of the path he had chosen. It was not the easy path, not the fastest path, but the path that fit with how he saw himself. And perhaps, precisely in moments like that, his true nature became clearer than ever, not as a goal-scoring player, not as someone who created explosive moments, but as a person who was determined, ready to face pressure in silence, and does not change even when the surrounding circumstances force him to do so. But like everything that had happened before, the cost of this journey was not shown on the outside. It did not lie in what others saw, but in what he had to go through throughout that process. And even though the final result was exoneration, what he carried with him was not only relief, but also another proof of the way he had always lived, without compromise, without stepping back, and without letting anything change the person he had become. After all those years playing at the highest level, after the pressures, the expectations, and the challenges that had shaped who he was, Xabi Alonso came to a decision that sooner or later had to happen, to stop. Not because he no longer had the ability to play football, not because he was forced to leave, but because he understood that there were times when continuing no longer carried the same meaning as before. The decision to retire did not come in an impulsive moment, but was the result of a long thinking process, where he had to face the reality that his body no longer responded as before, that the pace of the game was changing, and that maintaining the standards he had set for himself was becoming increasingly difficult. But understanding that did not make the decision any easier. When a person has devoted most of his life to one single thing, leaving it is not just a career change, but a change in the way of existing. Football was not just Alonso's job, but the structure of his life, the thing that shaped the way he thought, the way he reacted, the way he saw the world. Every day had a clear goal. Every week had matches to prepare for. Every season had a specific direction. And when all of that disappeared, what remained was not immediate freedom, but a void he had never had to face before. The day he left the grass was not a noisy day. There were no dramatic farewells, no exaggerated tears, no long-winded statements. He left in the way he had always lived, quietly, in control, without letting emotions exceed limits. But that very silence made the moment even heavier. When the noise of the stadium was no longer there, when the cheers were no longer there, when there were no more balls to handle, what remained was stillness, a stillness he could not control the way he had once controlled the match. The loss of the familiar rhythm of life did not happen immediately, but came gradually, in the days without training, in the weeks without matches, in the moments when he realized that nothing was waiting ahead the way he had been used to. There were no more tight schedules, no more requirements to meet, no more standards to maintain. For many people, that could be a release, but for Alonso, who was used to living in a system of strict discipline, the lack of structure became another challenge. That void was not only about time, but about role. On the grass, he always knew who he was, knew what he had to do, knew how he contributed. But when he left the grass, that question no longer had a clear answer. He was no longer the one regulating the match, no longer the center of tactical decisions, no longer part of a system where everything had a specific meaning. And when a person has been used to always having a clear role, losing it not only creates confusion, but also forces them to face a bigger question. If he is no longer a player, then who is he? In the first days after retirement, there was no pressure from the outside, no competition, no requirements to prove anything. But that did not mean relief. Instead, he had to learn how to live without the elements that had shaped his life. He had to find a new rhythm of life, a way of existing not based on the match schedule, not based on the match results, not based on what he had always been familiar with. And that was not an easy process, especially for a person who had spent his entire life controlling everything. Searching for a new direction was not about choosing another job, but about redefining himself. He did not rush into a new role, did not look for an immediate replacement for what had been lost. Instead, he took time to observe, to think, to understand that what he had gone through was not just a career, but a foundation for what would come after. But even in that process, one thing did not change: the way he approached everything. He still kept his calmness, still kept control, still kept the habit of not revealing too much, as if what he had learned on the grass continued to shape the way he lived outside it. There are players who leave the grass and immediately find a new direction, but there are also those who need time to understand that life does not end when the career ends. Alonso belonged to the second group. He did not rush, did not look for an immediate replacement, but accepted that silence as part of the journey. But silence did not mean emptiness. It was where thoughts accumulated, where questions were raised, where a person began to look back on his entire journey without being dominated by the demands of the present. And perhaps, precisely in the silence after that last day, he began to face something he had never really had time to think about before. Life outside football did not need to be controlled the way he had always done. But accepting that was not easy, because when a person has been used to controlling everything, letting go of control becomes a challenge greater than any match they have ever played in. The silence after the day he left the grass did not last forever, but it was long enough for Xabi Alonso to realize that he could not stay away from football for too long, not because he lacked options, but because football had become the way he understood the world, the way he thought and existed. Stepping into the coaching path did not come as a simple replacement, but as a continuation, where everything he had accumulated over many years began to find a new form of expression. But this time, everything was no longer the same. He was no longer the one executing, no longer the one directly controlling every pass, every movement, but became the one standing outside, observing, shaping, and making decisions for others. When he accepted to lead Bayer Leverkusen, that was not just a career opportunity, but a challenge he could not approach in the old way. On the grass, he could control himself, but here, he had to learn how to influence a collective, where each individual has different thoughts, emotions, and ways of reacting. What he once did naturally as a player now had to be communicated, had to be explained, had to be adjusted to fit each specific person. And in that process, he could not rely on silence as before, could not just do it and let others understand, but had to face the need to express, to say out loud the things he had always kept to himself before. The pressure in the new role did not decrease, but only changed its form. It was no longer the pressure of having to pass the ball accurately or hold the right position, but the pressure of having to make decisions that affect the whole team, of having to take responsibility for results he did not directly create on the field. When the team played well, the credit was shared, but when the team struggled, the eyes often turned to the man standing on the sidelines. And this time, he could no longer hide behind the role of a player. could no longer let his contributions blend into the collective without being noticed. Every decision of his was clear, every choice could be questioned, and every mistake carried a personal mark. Facing pressure in this way forced him to look back at himself, not only as the player he once was, but as the person he had become. The habits formed over many years, the silence, the control, the way of keeping everything inside no longer completely fit a role that required communication, connection, and the ability to convey. He could not ask the players to understand what he thought if he did not say it, could not build a system if he could not explain how it worked. And in that process, he had to learn to open up, not completely, but enough to create a bridge between what he knew and what the team needed. The experience accumulated from his playing career became the foundation, but not the answer to everything. He understood the game, understood how to control the match, understood how to read situations, but turning that knowledge into an effective operating system was a different process, more complex, requiring patience and adaptability. He carried with him what he had learned from those who had guided him, from Pep Guardiola to different periods in his career. But he did not copy, did not repeat, but adjusted to fit the people in the current situation. Gradually, a coaching identity began to form, not loud, not ostentatious, but clear in the way the team moved, in the way they controlled the match, in the way they reacted to pressure. It was not a copy of the past, but a combination of everything he had gone through, filtered and redefined in his own way. But even as he began to find stability in the new role, one thing still did not change: the way he faced everything. He did not become a coach who showed strong emotions, did not turn himself into the center of attention, did not change to fit the image others expected. He still kept his calmness, still kept the approach based on control and discipline, as if what had shaped him from the beginning continued to exist, only in a different form. But this time, he was not only controlling himself, but also had to learn how to control a larger, more complex system, where every element could influence each other. Facing himself was not a moment, but a prolonged process, where he gradually realized that what he had built throughout his career was not just skills, but a way of living, a way of approaching that he carried into every role. And in this new role, he could no longer hide himself, could no longer let his contributions stay behind the spotlight. He had to stand there, take responsibility, and accept that this time everything was no longer hidden by silence. But perhaps precisely in having nowhere left to hide, he began to understand himself more clearly, not as the perfect controller on the grass, but as a person who is still learning, still adjusting, still finding a way to balance between what he once was and what he needed to become. And in that journey, he did not abandon what had made him who he was, but carried it with him, as an inseparable part, even when facing a version of himself that he had never really seen before. Looking back at Xabi Alonso's entire journey, what emerges is not a story of collapses or dramatic events that the world easily recognizes, but a quiet flow of prolonged pressure through the years, a form of challenge that does not explode but never disappears. He did not have moments of collapsing in public, did not have times of losing control that broke his image, but the very fact that he never allowed that to happen became another journey, harder to see, harder to measure, but no less heavy. From the early days in a football family, to the biggest stadiums in Europe, to new roles outside the sidelines, he always maintained a state that few could keep for as long: continuous control, without interruption, without allowing deviation. In a world where emotions are often expressed as part of being human, he chose a different path, a path where emotions were kept, adjusted, and placed under a limit he never crossed, not because he had no emotions, but because he had learned not to let them dominate. But when a person lives too long in that state, the line between control and suppression becomes blurred, and what is not expressed does not disappear, but only exists in a different form, deeper, quieter, but always present. He did not allow himself to be weak in front of others. did not reveal moments when he was uncertain, did not seek comfort from the outside, and over time, that was no longer a conscious choice, but became instinct, a part of who he was. The success he achieved is undeniable. The titles, the matches, the moments he helped create are all proof of a career at the highest level. But behind those successes is a form of sacrifice that not everyone recognizes. A trade-off, not in the physical or time, but in the ability to allow himself to feel fully. When a person always has to maintain stability, always has to keep everything under control, they also have to give up a part of freedom, a part of randomness, a part of unpredictable emotions. And in Alonso's case, that sacrifice happened quietly, unspoken, unexpressed, but always there. The legacy he left is not explosive moments or overwhelming images, but something more lasting, more profound. It is the way he understood the game, the way he controlled it, the way he maintained a standard without needing to show off. It is the stability that teams relied on, the discipline he brought into every action, the ability to see what others might overlook. He did not change football with spectacular plays, but with the way he existed in it. A way of existing that made everything around clearer, more structured, easier to control. But perhaps the most important thing is not in what he did, but in how he did it. Without ostentation, without seeking attention, without the need for recognition beyond what was necessary, he did not build an image to be remembered, but simply lived according to a standard he believed was right and maintained it through every stage of his life. And precisely in that consistency, a truth becomes clearer. Not everyone needs to break to become strong, and not every story needs a collapse to be memorable. There are people who go through life with clear highs and lows, but there are also people like Alonso, where everything happens in a continuous range, without major interruptions. But that does not make it any lighter. A life without clear collapse does not mean there is no pressure, does not mean there are no internal battles. It only means that those battles take place in silence, unseen, unheard, but still leaving their mark in their own way. And perhaps that is the truth that not everyone realizes. It is not that he lived two separate lives, but that he lived one single life where everything was always kept under control, where perfection was not a goal but a requirement, and where the cost of never collapsing is not measured by what was clearly lost, but by what was never allowed to appear. The story of Xabi Alonso does not make people heartbroken because of clear collapses, but because of the prolonged silence throughout his life, a silence that began from a disciplined childhood, where he was not allowed to be wrong, not allowed to be weak, and continued with him to the biggest stadiums like Liverpool or Real Madrid, where he had to maintain perfection in every pass without ever showing pressure. When looking back at the moment of Istanbul 25, where he scored the iconic equalizer, what makes people feel sorry is not the victory, but the way he almost did not celebrate, as if even joy had to be controlled. And then in the period of being doubted, being considered for replacement, or when facing the prolonged tax case, he still chose silence, did not react, did not defend, only continued to endure in the way he had always lived. That is not strength in the usual sense, but a form of emotional sacrifice, where a person trades the right to be weak in order to keep an unbreakable image. For the American audience, where success often comes with showing personality and personal emotions, this story brings a different perspective. Resilience is not always loud, and the strongest people are sometimes those who never allow themselves to stop. The lesson here is not to live like Alonso, but to understand that behind every successful person there are unseen pressures, and in real life, allowing yourself to share, to rest, to be imperfect, is sometimes necessary so as not to lose yourself. If the story of Xabi Alonso makes you think, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is how you honor a person who has been strong in silence throughout his life. Thank you for following and see you in the next video where we will continue to explore stories where behind success there are always things that have never been told.